Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure on behalf of all colleagues that we're saddened to hear the announcement that's been made, and the thoughts and prayers of all of us.
It happened just minutes ago, the news that no one ever wanted to hear. Buckingham Palace, calm as ever on the outside, has released a message that shattered millions of hearts. A tragic development, they said. Just 4 words, yet they carried the weight of sorrow that words can barely hold. Cameras froze, reporters stumbled, and the crowd outside fell into uneasy silence. Something has gone terribly wrong behind those royal doors. The question now echoing across the world is chilling. Who has fallen? And why so suddenly? Join us as we reveal what went wrong in the palace. The morning that changed everything. King Charles III had always been a man of gentle contradictions. To the world, he was royalty, untouchable, formal, draped in centuries of tradition. But to those who truly knew him, he was something softer. He was a man who spoke to his garden plants as if they were old friends, who worried about the planet with the urgency of a father protecting his children, and who carried the weight of duty not as a burden thrust upon him, but as a sacred promise he'd made long ago to something greater than himself. Charles stirred before dawn, as he always did. Sleep had become an elusive companion in recent years, darting away the moment he reached for it. His body had learned to function on fragments of rest, stitched together between thoughts of duty and dreams of a simpler life that had never quite been his to live. He lay there for a moment, listening to the rain beginning its gentle assault against the window panes. Each drop seemed amplified in the stillness, creating a rhythm that felt almost deliberately insistent. There was something comforting about his morning routine, a series of small rituals that anchored him to normalcy despite the extraordinary nature of his existence. He rose slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in his joints, a reminder that time spares no one, not even kings. The palace around him remained wrapped in its early morning quietude, the usual bustle of staff and officials still hours away. This was his time, the only truly private moments in a life lived perpetually in the public eye. His study welcomed him like an old friend. The familiar scent of aged leather and paper hung in the air, mixed with the faint aroma of the flowers he'd brought in from his beloved gardens the day before. He prepared his tea himself, a small act of independence he cherished, watching the steam rise from the cup like morning mist over the Thames. There was something almost meditative about the process, the simple humanity of it grounding him in a way that royal ceremony never quite could. The correspondence waiting on his desk seemed to multiply each day, an endless stream of letters, petitions, and reports from the various charities and organizations that bore his name and his heart. He'd spent decades building these connections, pouring his passion into causes that others had once dismissed as eccentric: environmental conservation, architectural preservation, sustainable farming. These weren't just royal hobbies to him. They were missions, legacies he hoped would outlive the crown itself. His private journal lay open on the desk, its pages filled with his distinctive handwriting. The last entry remained unfinished, trailing off mid-thought as so many of his personal reflections did these days. There never seemed to be enough time for everything, even with a lifetime of service behind him. The words stared back at him, patient, waiting for completion that might never come. Among the papers sat a particular letter he'd been drafting for weeks, a letter to Prince William. Not official correspondence, but something deeper, more personal. He wanted to share the wisdom that only experience could teach, the lessons learned from carrying a burden that few could truly understand. But each time he tried to finish it, the words felt inadequate. How could he express in mere sentences what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to find joy in duty when duty demanded everything? Tomorrow, he thought to himself, as he had thought so many times before, I'll finish it tomorrow. The palace gardens stretched out beyond his window, still shrouded in the half-light of early morning. He'd walked those paths countless times, often alone with his thoughts, finding solace in the growing things that asked nothing of him except care and patience. The rain had intensified now, drops racing down the glass panes, distorting the carefully manicured landscape into something dreamlike and unfocused. A sharp wave of discomfort suddenly crossed his chest, quick and unexpected, like a visitor who'd arrived without knocking. He paused, one hand instinctively moving to press against his ribs. The sensation passed almost as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only a faint echo of unease. He dismissed it with the same stoic resilience that had carried him through 7 decades of life in the spotlight. There was too much to do to pay attention to every small complaint his aging body might voice. Returning to his reading, his eyes fell upon a framed photograph sitting on the corner of his desk. Camilla smiled back at him from the image, surrounded by children and grandchildren, all of them caught in a moment of genuine happiness. He felt his expression soften, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the tea growing cold in his cup. Despite everything, the scrutiny, the judgment, the endless years of waiting, he'd found something real, something true. "My dear," he whispered to the photograph, his voice barely audible even to himself. The family portrait beside it showed a broader view, generations connected by blood and duty, by love and responsibility. Each face represented a life he'd touched, a legacy continuing forward even as he stood in the present. William, strong and ready. Harry, complicated and distant. His grandchildren, innocent and full of futures not yet written. They were his real work, more important than any speech or ceremony could ever be. He picked up his pen again, determined to make progress on the letter to William. "There's so much still left to do," he murmured, the words escaping almost unconsciously. "So many conversations left to have, so much wisdom left to share, so many sunrises yet to witness over those gardens he loved so dearly." The discomfort returned, no longer a polite visitor but an uninvited intruder, sharp and insistent and refusing to be ignored. His vision blurred at the edges. The room seemed to tilt slightly, reality becoming untethered from its moorings. The teacup slipped from his other hand, seeming to fall in slow motion. He watched it tumble through space, the remaining tea arcing through the air like a liquid amber ribbon. It shattered against the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet study, porcelain fragments scattering across ancient wood. King Charles III collapsed forward, his body surrendering to forces beyond his control or understanding. Papers scattered. The pen rolled away, leaving an incomplete line trailing across the unfinished letter. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and Camilla entered like a shadow wrapped in silk. When the crown weighs heaviest, Queen Camilla had worn her armor so long that most people forgot there was a woman underneath it at all. She could walk into a room and the temperature would drop by several degrees, not because she intended it, but because she had learned long ago that warmth made you vulnerable. Warmth lets people in, and people, in her experience, were rarely kind. She had perfected the art of the distant smile, the polite nod that said nothing at all. Staff members hurried past her in corridors, their eyes cast downward. She never asked how they were, never paused to make small talk by the windows overlooking the gardens. Why should she? They did not want her friendship. They wanted the version of her that stayed quiet, stayed out of the way, stayed convenient. But on that particular afternoon, when she pushed open the heavy oak door to the king's private study, something shifted in the universe itself. The room smelled of old books and leather, just as it always did. Afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, catching particles of dust that drifted through the air like tiny, lazy stars. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for him. Charles sat in his chair by the desk, slumped forward in a way that was entirely wrong. His hand rested on a stack of papers, fingers still curled as though he had been in the middle of a thought when the world simply stopped making sense. "Charles!" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She took one step forward, then another, her heels clicking against the wooden floor in a rhythm that sounded too loud, too normal for what was happening. "Charles, are you?" But she knew. Even before she reached him, even before she touched his shoulder and felt how heavily he leaned into the chair, she knew. The air in the room turned to glass, fragile, about to shatter. She opened her mouth to call for help, but nothing came out at first. Her throat had closed up entirely. When the scream finally tore free, it sounded like someone else entirely. "Help! Someone help us!" The response was immediate. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. The door burst open and suddenly the quiet room filled with people, physicians in dark suits carrying leather bags, the private secretary with his face already drained of color, guards speaking urgently into radios. Camilla stepped back, pressed herself against the bookshelf, and watched as they descended upon him. Someone was checking his pulse, another was loosening his collar. A third was pulling equipment from a bag with practiced efficiency. She wanted to do something, anything, but her body had forgotten how to move. Her hands hung useless at her sides, trembling like leaves before a storm. One of the physicians looked up at her. "Your Majesty, we need space to work." She nodded, mute, and let someone guide her toward the door. But she could not stop looking back, could not stop watching them work over him, their hands moving with terrible urgency. The door closed between them, and she found herself in a side room she barely recognized, a sitting room perhaps, pale blue walls, a painting of horses, a clock ticking somewhere. She sat down because her legs would no longer hold her. Her mind, desperate for escape, tumbled backward through time. She remembered the first time she had made him laugh, really laugh, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him forget, just for a moment, the weight of everything he carried. They had been walking through the gardens at Highgrove, and she had said something ridiculous about the chickens. What was it? She could not remember now, but she remembered the sound of his laughter, warm and surprised, as though he had forgotten such a thing was possible. She remembered the years when loving him had felt like standing in the middle of a hurricane. The papers had been merciless. The public had been worse. Everywhere she went, she saw the judgment in people's eyes, felt the weight of their disappointment. She was the villain in a story she had never asked to be part of. But Charles had stayed. Even when it would have been easier to walk away, even when his advisors had begged him to choose differently, he had stayed. And slowly, so slowly she had barely noticed it happening, something had changed between them. The sharp edges had softened. The desperate, frantic quality of their early years together had settled into something quieter, something that felt almost like peace. She had learned to love the small things about him, the way he worried too much about everything, the way he cared so deeply about things most people dismissed as foolish. Architecture and organic farming and the proper way to preserve old buildings. The way he worked himself to exhaustion because he believed, truly believed, that he could make things better. "He never rested," she whispered to the empty room. I told him so many times." But Charles had never been good at resting. He had worn the crown for such a short time, really, and he had wanted so desperately to matter, to leave things better than he had found them. The door opened. A physician stood there, his face carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, we've stabilized him for now, but his condition is critical. We're doing everything we can." She nodded, found her voice somewhere. "May I see him?" "In a few moments. We're still working." The door closed again. Outside, she could hear the palace coming alive with terrible purpose. Phones rang in distant rooms. Footsteps hurried up and down corridors. Guards spoke in low, urgent voices. The machinery of monarchy was already moving, preparing for whatever came next. Camilla sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt the ice inside her begin to crack. She had spent so many years being strong, being composed, being the woman everyone expected her to be. She had perfected the art of not feeling, of not letting anything show on her face that might be used against her later. But now, alone in this pale blue room with a clock ticking somewhere and the sound of organized chaos bleeding through the walls, she felt something break open inside her chest. She was not ready. Not for this. Not for the empty chair across from her at breakfast. Not for the silence where his voice should be. Not for a world that continued spinning without him in it. Her hands would not stop shaking. She pressed them together harder, as though she could force them into stillness through sheer will, as though she could force everything back into order if she just tried hard enough. But some things could not be willed back into place. When tomorrow becomes today. Prince William had always carried himself with a certain warmth that seemed to soften the edges of royal formality. Behind the titles and the duties, there lived a man who loved deeply and worried quietly, who carried the weight of expectation without ever complaining, and who had learned through personal tragedy that life could change in a single heartbeat. That Tuesday afternoon in Windsor began like any other. The autumn light filtered through tall windows as William reviewed correspondence in his study, occasionally glancing at photographs of Catherine and the children scattered across his desk. The house felt peaceful, almost sleepy, with only the distant sound of gardeners working outside breaking the silence. Then his phone rang. The voice on the other end was controlled but urgent. Palace, medical emergency, his father. William felt something shift inside his chest, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly tilted. Time seemed to slow and accelerate all at once. He stood frozen for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, his mind struggling to process words that did not quite make sense yet somehow made terrible sense. Within moments he was moving. Keys, coat, security detail scrambling into formation. The drive to London became a blur of gray motorway and his own racing thoughts. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but memory kept pulling him backward. He remembered being a boy, watching his father from a distance, never quite understanding the man who seemed always preoccupied with important matters. There had been years of coldness between them, years when duty and tradition built walls that love struggled to climb. But time had softened things. Recent months had brought conversations they should have had decades ago. There had been forgiveness, though much of it remained unspoken, living in the space between words rather than in the words themselves. William pressed his forehead against the cool window glass, watching the countryside blur into suburbs, then into the city. He was caught between two versions of himself. One was simply a son, terrified of losing his father, desperate to turn back time to say all the things he had never quite managed to say. The other was the heir, the future king, already feeling the invisible crown settling onto his shoulders with crushing weight. He did not want to be that second person yet, please, not yet. The car pulled through palace gates that had stood for centuries, witnessing countless arrivals of people carrying news both joyous and devastating. William's hands trembled slightly as he stepped out into the courtyard. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet nothing would ever be the same. Camilla stood outside the heavy oak doors leading to the king's private chambers. She looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way he had never seen her. No makeup could hide the redness around her eyes or the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. They stood facing each other for a long moment. No words came because none seemed adequate. What could anyone say in such a moment? Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange passed years of complicated history, recent understanding, and shared terror. She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly before stepping aside. The corridor felt impossibly long. His footsteps echoed against marble floors worn smooth by generations of royals who had walked these same halls toward their own moments of crisis. William's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the door. He paused, hand on the brass handle, taking one more breath of the world as it had been before stepping into whatever waited on the other side. The room was dimmer than he expected. Heavy curtains blocked most of the afternoon light, and several lamps cast warm pools of illumination that somehow made the shadows deeper. Royal physicians stood in quiet consultation near the window, their voices low murmurs. Medical equipment beeped softly, keeping time with a rhythm that should have been reassuring, but instead felt ominous. And there, in the center of it all, lay his father. The king looked terribly small in the large bed, surrounded by white linens and pillows. This man, who had always seemed so imposing, so permanent, now appeared fragile as autumn leaves. William approached slowly, hardly breathing, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this awful moment into something even worse. He pulled a chair close and sat, then reached for his father's hand. The skin felt papery and cool. William held it gently, carefully, as if it might break. "Everything will be fine," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "You're going to be fine." But even as he spoke, he tasted the lie. Nothing felt fine. Nothing looked fine. The physicians' faces told a story their medical jargon tried to obscure. His phone began vibrating insistently in his pocket. He pulled it out just enough to see the screen lighting up with messages from palace aides, from officials, from people already preparing for what protocol demanded must be prepared for. Statements being drafted, announcements being planned. The machinery of succession is already grinding into motion. He shoved the phone back into his pocket without reading any of it. Not yet. He wasn't ready to be that person yet. The room smelled strange. Antiseptic mixed with something else, old leather perhaps, or aged paper. Books lined the far wall, volumes his father had collected over decades. William found himself staring at their spines, thinking how odd it was that books outlasted the people who loved them, how fragile human life was, even when crowned, especially when crowned. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost its usual meaning. William sat holding his father's hand, occasionally speaking soft words of comfort, watching the steady rise and fall of labored breathing. He thought about all the moments they had shared and all the moments they had missed. He thought about his own children and hoped desperately that he had done better at telling them he loved them. He hoped they would never doubt it, not for a single day. Finally, William stood. His legs felt stiff, his back ached from sitting hunched forward. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to his father's forehead, lingering there for just a moment, breathing in the familiar scent that had meant safety when he was very small. But he knew what was coming and what had to be done. The day of the announcement. For centuries, the palace stood tall and unmoved, a fortress of marble and tradition, a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to the rise and fall of monarchs. It had watched coronations and funerals, weddings and wars. It had seen joy spill through its ballrooms and grief settle into its corners like dust. But nothing in all its long memory had prepared it for the weight of that particular morning. Inside the communications room, the air was thick and still. Senior aides sat hunched over desks, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Secretaries moved quietly, their usual chatter replaced by something far more solemn. Papers were shuffled. Words were typed, deleted, and typed again. Every sentence mattered. Every comma carried weight. They were writing the announcement, the one no one ever wanted to write. One woman pressed her fingers to her lips as she reread the draft. Her hands were shaking. Another man stared at the screen, his eyes glassy, as if hoping the words might change on their own. But they wouldn't. The truth was the truth, and it sat there on the page, cold and final. Down the hall, past the portraits of queens and kings long gone, the doors to the king's private room were closed. They had been closed for hours now. No staff entered. No press was allowed near. Only family, only doctors, only those who had earned the right to be there in the end. Inside, the light was soft. The curtains were drawn, not to keep the world out, but to keep the moment sacred. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, of medicine and memory. It was quiet, save for the slow, steady rhythm of breathing, fragile and fading. Camilla sat at the bedside, her posture perfect even now, even in this. She had always been strong, always composed, but today her shoulders carried a burden too great to hide. Her hand rested over his, fingers curled gently around his palm. She had held that hand for years, through laughter and scandal, through public doubt and private devotion, and now she held it one last time. Her eyes were red, but she did not look away. She would not look away. William stood beside her, tall and still as a statue. His face was unreadable, carved from something harder than grief. He did not move, did not blink. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped in front of him as if holding himself together by sheer will. He had been trained for this, prepared for this, but no amount of training could make it easier. The doctors stood near the foot of the bed, their expressions somber and practiced. They had done this before, too many times, but it never got easier. Not when the life slipping away belonged to a king. And then, in a breath so soft it barely stirred the air, it happened. The king took his last breath. It was not dramatic. There was no gasp, no final word, just a slow, gentle exhale and then stillness. A stillness so complete it seemed to swallow the room whole. For a moment, no one moved. No one dared. Then quietly, one of the doctors stepped forward. He placed 2 fingers against the king's wrist, then his neck. He waited. He checked again, And then, with the kind of solemnity that only comes from bearing unbearable news, he looked up and gave a small, slow nod. The king was gone. Camilla's breath hitched. A single sob broke from her chest, raw and involuntary, and she covered her mouth with her free hand as if to hold the rest inside. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. She did not wipe them away. She just sat there holding his hand because letting go would make it real. William closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell, slow and controlled. He did not cry, not yet, not here. But his hand moved to rest on his father's shoulder just for a moment, as if to say goodbye in the only way he knew how. No one spoke. Not for 1 minute. Not for 2. The silence stretched on, thick and sacred, a moment held in suspension between what was and what would be. Outside, the palace flag began to lower. It moved slowly, inch by inch, pulled by hands that had done this before but never wanted to again. The fabric fluttered softly in the breeze, sinking toward half-mast like a final curtain falling. People on the street stopped and looked up. Some gasped, some cried. They did not need an announcement. They knew. Back inside, in the communications room, an aide lifted the printed statement from the desk. His hands were steady, but his face was not. He walked down the corridor, past the guards who stood at attention, past the portraits that seemed to watch him go. He reached the king's private study where William now stood alone by the window. The aide knocked softly. William turned. Without a word, the paper was handed over. William took it. His eyes moved across the words, slow and deliberate, as if reading them might somehow change what they said. But they did not change. They never would. It is with deep sorrow that Buckingham Palace announces the passing of His Majesty the King. His vision blurred. The letters swam together, dissolving into smudges of black and white. He blinked hard, forcing them back into focus. His hand reached for the pen on the desk. It felt heavier than it should have. He signed his name, William, Prince of Wales, son, heir. His hand trembled as he set the pen down. The chapter of his father's reign was over, and his own, whether he was ready or not, had just begun. The aide took the paper and left without a sound. Minutes later, the palace gates were opened, not with ceremony, but with quiet resignation. The world had been waiting. The world always waited, and now it would know. Bells began to toll across the city, soft at first, then louder, spreading like ripples across water. One church, then another, then another. The sound rolled through London, through the countryside, through the nation. A sound of mourning, a sound of ending. The Princess of Wales now found herself woven into the heart of this unfolding storm. But what part was she meant to play, and what hidden strength was she quietly holding on to beneath her calm, graceful exterior? Princess Kate's strength of silence. Princess Catherine had always been the kind of woman who carried grace like a second skin. Not the practiced, polished grace taught in palace corridors, but something deeper, something that came from within. Beneath the designer dresses and the carefully maintained composure lived a woman of remarkable emotional intelligence, someone who could read a room, a moment, or a wounded soul with uncanny precision. On this particular evening, as dusk settled over Windsor Castle like a heavy blanket, Catherine sat on the edge of the smallest bed, her hands folded in her lap, searching for words that might make the incomprehensible slightly more bearable. The children looked at her with wide, questioning eyes, waiting for their mother to make sense of what adults had been whispering about all day. "Grandpa is with the angels now," Catherine said softly, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. The words hung in the air between them. She watched as her youngest processed this information with the literal mindedness of childhood, while the older ones began to grasp the weight behind the simple phrase. She answered their questions with patience and honesty, never talking down to them, never pretending the hurt would disappear by morning. She held them close when tears came and remained silent when silence felt right. But beneath her calm exterior, Catherine was fighting her own battle. Each comforting word she spoke to the children was like lifting a heavy stone because she knew what lay ahead. The public mourning, the ceremonies, the cameras, the eyes of millions watching her children navigate grief while learning to be royal, learning to keep their chins up and their emotions carefully measured. The weight of that knowledge pressed against her ribs, making each breath a conscious effort. When the children finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted from crying and confusion, Catherine remained in the nursery for a long while. She sat in the upholstered chair near the window, watching the darkness deepen outside, listening to the quiet breathing of her sleeping children. In these stolen moments between duty and duty, she allowed herself to simply exist in the sadness. The sound of a car on the gravel drive reached her ears late in the evening. She rose from the chair, smoothed her clothes, and made her way downstairs. Her footsteps echoed softly in the vast corridors, past portraits of ancestors who had faced their own losses, their own impossible moments. William appeared at the doorway looking like a man who had aged a decade in a single day. His face was ashen, drained of its usual color. His shoulders, which normally carried responsibility with practiced ease, now seemed to curve inward under an invisible weight. His eyes held a kind of emptiness that Catherine recognized immediately, the look of someone whose world had fundamentally shifted while they were still trying to orient themselves. She moved toward him without hesitation, without words. Sometimes language fails in the face of profound loss, and this was one of those moments. She simply wrapped her arms around him and felt him lean into the embrace with the full weight of his grief. They stood there in the doorway, two people who were photographed and discussed and analyzed by millions, who carried titles that stretched back centuries, who had responsibilities that would only grow heavier in the days ahead. But right now, they were just William and Kate, just husband and wife, just two people who loved each other, holding on while the world tilted beneath their feet. Eventually, they moved to the private sitting room, a smaller, more intimate space than the grand rooms where official business was conducted. Here, the furniture was comfortable and worn in all the right places. Here, family photographs sat on side tables, and the fireplace had been lit against the evening chill. They sat together on the sofa, neither reaching for conversation, both understanding that silence could be its own form of communication. Catherine studied her husband's profile in the flickering firelight. She could see the boy he had been, the one who had lost his mother too young, the one who had learned to grieve in front of cameras. She could see the weight of memory in his eyes, the complicated tangle of emotions that comes from losing a father with whom the relationship had been complex, layered with love and duty and expectation. "The envelope," Catherine said gently, breaking the silence. "Perhaps now is the time." Earlier that day, while sorting through papers in the king's study, they had discovered a sealed envelope bearing William's name in his father's distinctive handwriting. William had tucked it into his jacket pocket, unable to face it at that moment, needing time before he could confront whatever final words his father had chosen to leave behind. Now he reached into his pocket with slow, reluctant movements. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy paper stock, the kind reserved for important correspondence. His name was written across the front in ink that had slightly bled at the edges. His father's hand had been unsteady when he wrote it. William stared at the envelope for a long moment, as if trying to divine its contents without breaking the seal. Catherine placed her hand gently on his knee, a quiet reassurance that whatever he found inside, he would not face it alone. He finally opened it with careful fingers, extracting several pages covered in his father's handwriting. The note was not formal or flowery. It was simple, direct, achingly personal. Words about kindness in a world that often valued strength over compassion. Reflections on patience, on taking time to truly see people, on the importance of legacy beyond titles and tradition. A father trying to distill a lifetime of lessons into a few pages, knowing these would be his last words to his son. William began reading aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine watched as the words washed over him, some landing like balm on old wounds, others opening new spaces of loss. Halfway through, his voice cracked and broke. He paused, struggling to compose himself, but Catherine placed her hand over his, silently encouraging him to continue. And he did, pushing through the tears, giving voice to his father's final gift. When he finished, William carefully refolded the pages and set them aside. Neither spoke immediately. What was there to say? The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through ancient trees. Somewhere in the vast castle, a clock chimed the late hour. They sat together as the night deepened, hands clasped, shoulders touching. Tomorrow would bring all the machinery of state mourning, the protocols, the ceremonies, the careful choreography of public grief. Tomorrow they would need to be strong again, composed again, royal again. But tonight, they gave themselves permission to simply be human, to grieve, to remember, to hold on to each other while the world outside prepared itself for what was to come. The fire burned lower. Their clasped hands remained steady, and in the quiet of that room, two people faced the oldest truth humanity has ever known, that love persists even when those we love cannot, that grief is just love with nowhere left to go, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in standing alone, but in leaning on someone who understands your heart. A son's promise. William had always carried kindness like a quiet flame within him. He grew into a man who listened more than he spoke, whose smile reached his eyes with genuine warmth. Those close to him knew he wrestled constantly with the weight of his destiny, yet he never let that burden harden him. He loved deeply, his wife, his children, his country, and that love showed in small gestures others might overlook. Inside the palace, William stood alone in the king's dressing room. The space still held traces of his father, a book left open on the side table, reading glasses folded carefully beside it, the faint scent of cologne hanging in the air. Morning light crept through the heavy curtains, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny stars. William faced the mirror, watching his own hands fumble with his tie. The simple task suddenly felt impossible. His fingers refused to cooperate, and he had to start over twice before the knot would hold. In the reflection, he saw fear swimming in his eyes, but beneath it lay something steadier, a quiet determination settling into his bones. The door opened gently, and Camilla stepped inside. Grief had etched itself into the lines of her face, her eyes red from crying, yet she stood upright with remarkable dignity. She moved beside him, placing one hand softly on his arm. When she spoke, her voice trembled but carried absolute conviction. "Your father would be so very proud of you." William's throat tightened, making words impossible. He could only nod, blinking back the sting of tears. She squeezed his arm once, a gesture of comfort and solidarity, then quietly left him to his thoughts. The walk through the grand corridor stretched before him like a journey through time itself. Each footstep echoed against marble floors, the sound bouncing off walls that had witnessed centuries of history. Portraits lined both sides, monarchs frozen in paint and memory, their eyes seeming to follow his progress. Some faces he recognized from childhood stories. Others belonged to legends so old their true personalities had dissolved into myth. Yet all of them watched him now, this man carrying forward a legacy older than nations. The weight of their collective gaze pressed against him, but William kept walking, his steps steady despite the trembling in his chest. The throne room opened before him in golden splendor. Sunlight poured through tall windows, making the polished floors gleam like water. There sat the throne on its raised platform, worn smooth by generations of kings and queens. Beside it, on a cushion of deep blue velvet, rested his father's crown. The jewels caught the light and scattered it across the room, sapphires that held the depth of oceans, rubies bright as heart's blood, diamonds that sparkled with cold fire. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. William climbed the steps slowly, each one bringing him closer to a destiny he had always known awaited him, but never truly felt ready to embrace. He reached the top and stood between the empty throne and the waiting crown. His hand lifted toward the precious metal, hovering close enough to feel the cool air around it, but he did not touch it. Not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes and let the world fall away. In that private darkness, he spoke without words to his father, to his grandmother, to all those who had carried this burden before him. He made a promise, simple, honest, from the deepest part of himself. He would serve with his whole heart. He would lead with humility. He would honor what came before while building something worthy of tomorrow. When evening arrived, William prepared to speak to the nation. He wore a simple dark suit, refusing the formal robes his advisors suggested. When the cameras turned on, He looked directly into them and spoke as himself, not as a distant figurehead, but as a grieving son. I stand before you tonight having lost my father. The pain I feel is not unique to kings or princes. It belongs to anyone who has ever loved and lost. My father spent his entire life serving this nation with dedication I can only hope to match. Tonight I honor his memory and thank you all for the compassion you have shown. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the emotion beneath his composed exterior. There were no grand promises, no rehearsed speeches, just honest words from an honest heart. As twilight painted the sky, William walked to the palace balcony. He pushed open the doors and stepped into the cool evening air. Below him, London stretched into the distance, lights beginning to twinkle as night gathered. The city that had been silent all day seemed ready to breathe again. Above, the sky blazed with gold and pink, the sun's final gift before darkness fell. What do you think about Prince William's new role and King Charles's condition? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click on the following video on your screen. You will enjoy it.